Now what is going on here now, boys? Soon, Diablo 2 Resurrected will have a brand new patch, completely changing a lot of things for the first time in like 20 years. The shit's kind of insane when you think about it. I'm absolutely loving the PTR, or the public test realm, that they're blessing us with here to test these patches before they go live. Many people have been asking about what my thoughts are on patch 2.4 as it pertains to PvP. Let's jump in. First and foremost, I'm going to say I'm actually pretty impressed with this patch in a lot of ways. Obviously, I do have some concerns, but overall, not bad. So I want to start by talking about probably one of the biggest changes to PvP in years, and probably one of the healthiest ones in my opinion. So one of the changes that they are implementing in this new patch surrounds faster hit recovery in PvP. We got a little bit of a glimpse of it in the patch notes, but it was kind of esoteric and difficult to really understand without seeing it live. For years, players who stepped out into the Bloodmoor would have to worry about getting locked down perpetually, unable to cast their skills by assassins, barbs, chargers, you name it. There was so many ways to completely lock a player out from being able to respond at all to what you're doing. The change that they mentioned in the patch notes surrounding hit recovery as it pertains to players kind of looks like this. Basically, a player will get stunned on the first hit, but then there's some ensuing invincibility frames with FHR. This doesn't make your character invincible, but it just makes it so that you can't necessarily be stunned again within a certain number of frames. This makes it so that if an assassin just holds down their name lock and mind blasts you, it will only be one hit that stuns you, and eventually after a few frames you'll be able to teleport out or walk around or charge or move or do what you need to do to escape. The same is true for leap locks on a barb or smites or charges from a paladin. All of these things have historically been able to completely lock players into this stun animation, and it appears as though that's a thing of the past. A lot of players who play the assassin as their main PvP character kind of fired up about this, but I will say, as someone who has played a paladin for 20 years, there's a reason for that. I absolutely hate stun locks, and I've loved being able to charge out of them with that class and not have to worry about getting stuck. Although some people will feel some type of way about this, I have to say this is a huge step in the right direction for PvP. Now granted, this kind of comes with a setback. Sins used to be an S-tier build in PvP, and I do believe this knocks them down a couple of pegs. I do sort of have a proposed solution for that, though, and it kind of surrounds the entire build of a dual claw assassin. For so many years, you've needed very specific gear on a dual claw assassin to be able to hit the 102% faster cast rate breakpoint. I think it's probably time, especially with this change, that gets lowered a bit. It basically pigeonholes dual claw assassins into wearing Griffin's Eye, and back in the days of LOD, you would need an 08 Volk with certain setups. It kind of pigeonholes them into that, and it doesn't really give them a lot of options for gear. If that got lowered a bit so that Sins could hit a reasonable cast rate frame while wielding two claws, I think it would be also a step in the right direction. And considering now that Sins have been knocked down quite a few pegs, I think for sure Sins need buffs. The same thing could be said for their inherent attack speed. For so many years, Sins have needed very specific claws to be able to lay traps at a reasonable pace. Now, of course, you could use Burst of Speed to correct that. However, in PvP, oftentimes Sins opt for Fade because of the buff to damage reduction and resistances, so they kind of need that for their survivability. It just would be really nice to see Sins be able to use different claws rather than GTs or runic talons to hit their breakpoints. And I say we don't get carried away. Perhaps that's something that we can kind of assess this patch and look at in the future, but I think it may be healthy to go in that direction. Regardless, going back to the original assessment of the FHR changes in PvP, very well done. I'm very impressed. That is a huge step in the right direction. Along those same lines, when we saw changes concerning Leap in the patch notes, some people were a little scared. As you might know, Leap in PvP has been used to lock down teams of players in similar ways to this Mind Blast conundrum. Not only is the FHR no longer a thing in that situation, however, when you actually look at Leap, the change that they made is that they sped up the animation for it, but the recovery frames that it takes for your barb to land or to leap have actually stayed the same. So in PvP, when players take these very short leaps. The animation for them is actually not really a lot faster. This was really good foresight on behalf of the programmers here, so very well done on that. Now, if you could only fix alt whirlwinding and short whirlwinding, that'd be great. Another thing we were concerned about in the patch notes were the changes to Guided Arrow. Guided Arrow was already extremely powerful in PvP, and it did get a bit of a damage buff in this patch. But after building a Zon in single player to kind of test the maximum damage that this thing could do previously versus how much it could do now, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. On the high end, it's a difference between about 400 and 600 damage, which equates to about 100 damage in PvP. Now, granted, you will be getting shot with a lot of guided arrows in the course of a duel. That being said, I don't really think this change will encourage many people to use guided arrow in PvM, so I'm still a little confused about why this was changed, but the effect isn't as far blown as I might have anticipated. However, another change that was made in this patch kinda is. This was my silver bullet suggestion right here, like, hey, please shoot this out of the sky before it comes down. This is gonna be bad. There's no way it can't be bad. It's bad. And that is the changes to Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit is a dominant skill in PvP used by Bone Mancers or Bone Necros, and it was already an S tier build before this change. A decked out Necro at that time could do about 5.4 thousand damage with a Bone Spirit. After the patch changes or balance changes to this skill, a Necro can hit about 7.4 thousand damage, which is less than I had originally estimated off of my off-the-cuff math, but still, it's pretty insane. The same logic applies where I don't really think this is gonna make a big difference in PvM. Like literally, how many videos have you seen out of people being like, check out my new Bone Necro in PvM, it's so great. There's literally none. It's very underwhelming still, but the effects that it has on PvP is pretty devastating. When you consider the fact that a lot of Bone Necros will kind of stay off your map and launch these things from across the screen, due to a glitch that's existed in the game since the days of Lord of Destruction, you won't be able to see these Bone Spirits from across the screen, so you're gonna get hit with devastating damage that you can't really interact with, that now hits even harder than it did. 30%, just about 30% to be exact. This change single-handedly brings a Bone Necro post-patch into outer space with the tier level of what it is in PvP. Again, I would just suggest that we dial this damage back down to what it was before. There's really no reason for it to be a lot higher. I've said for a long time that I don't believe all of the skills that exist in a skill tree of all characters in Diablo 2 were meant for PvM, and Bone Spirit is definitely one of them. But even if that's not how you feel, there was another skill that kind of follows this same agenda here, and that is FOH. The Vindicator Paladin, or VT, was something that was already an S tier build in PvP, and I think it gets even crazier with a shorter cooldown. Now, will this absolutely break the build compared to other things? It's really hard to tell that in the patch. We have very limited items on other classes. For example, we can't really test Amazons in PvP without going out and magic finding certain items to make faith bows. There's just a lot of stuff that you can't test based on the items that you're given in the PTR. But as Sweet Phil said in one of his videos, I do believe that this is still outclassed in PvM by a Auradins. So the effects of this lowered cooldown on FOH, I don't think will have a lot of effects on PvM, but it does have a pretty significant effect in PvP. I'm still kind of undecided on it though. Again, I'm not really sure how much it pushes it far over the top. It just makes an already S tier build a lot better. However, along those same lines though, some of these character balances may actually lead to more viable builds in PvP. Now granted, I'm just going to give you a very short list here. Just know there's probably a lot more that people either haven't discovered or tested yet in this PTR, but these are the ones that particularly stood out in public duel games. And the first one is the Volcano Druid. This is actually a very interesting class here. Now Volcano will do physical and fire damage, and you can combine this with attacks like Fissure for a more diversified approach to how you attack your opponent. The cool thing about having a Volcano Druid versus a Wind Druid or Tornado Tornado Druid is that previously a Tornado Druid would have to basically stomp their opponent to land a tornado, and now you can actually keep your distance on your opponent and just light a volcano up underneath them to do some pretty significant damage. So now, having a character such as a Druid, you no longer have to completely close the distance or get dangerously close to your opponent to be able to hit them as a caster. I think that's really cool, and it could have some long-lasting effects on a Volcano Druid that might be actually viable in PvP. Another cool character that we saw in the Bloodmoor was the Hydra Sork. Obviously, you guys know that there has been some pretty serious changes to the skill Hydra. When you couple this with the fact that a lot of PvP players tend to CT cast their spells, this just means that you can cast a ton of Hydras from about 2 screens away up on your opponent. This now allows a Fire Sork to really keep distance on her opponent and pose a threat from quite far away. Although some people might feel some type of way about that style of dueling, like it or not, that's probably gonna be a thing. But one thing I will say that has had probably the biggest negative effect on PvP, not just PvP, but I think the game in general, is the fact that we see a whole bunch of classes now that can just slap on Dream or Dragon and do a lot of damage. This was pretty evident in the Bloodmoor when people would just use sorceresses and slap on Dream or Dragon and do some pretty serious damage in combination to their other elemental attacks. I think it really speaks to the larger problem here, and you know, I had to really tone myself down on this because I know how some people feel about the class Auradin. Now granted, a lot of people come to the aid of an Auradin and they say, hey, that's only on players 1. You know, that's like one thing that they say, like that's some sort of like defense to it. And then something else that people say is like, oh, well, it's so expensive that, you know, when I build an Auradin and I put that many high runes in it, I deserve to go walk through the game and kill everything. I just can't personally get on board with either piece of that logic. I stick by my guns in saying that I don't believe that, you know, making an Auradin like this, just being able to walk through level 85 areas of the game that even contain fire immunes and just being able to level everything so easily is the level of challenge that was intended from this game. When you consider that a lot of PvP takes place on non-ladder, over the course of the long run, that handful of high runes is really not that expensive. I know some people don't care about non-ladder, or they're like, fuck PvP. But again, I think you're forgetting about a very important aspect of balance to the game. And I think it's very ignorant to, you know, just completely throw something out because it doesn't fit your agenda of what you do and say, hey, game is balanced because I don't care about this. Granted, no doubt, as a longtime fan of this game, if no changes are made to the way that auras work in this patch when it's released, I'll be the first player to put together an Auradin and just walk around the game trying to farm high runes in just about any area. But also, as a longtime fan of this game, I remember the days of aura stacking and how miserable that was, not just in PvP, but it just made the game way too easy in PvM. I think this patch returns us to those days, and I'm not really sure if it's a good thing. My personal suggestion is just let auras go back to how they were. Auradins have always been a lesser tier build, and for good reason. Having an overpowered aura that doesn't require you to attack, click on, or interact with minions or players in any way is just kind of a lazy way to play. Fight me. I put together a sort of arbitrary PvP tier list just based on some of the things we've seen. Now, granted, we weren't able to really fully test all of these classes in multiplayer, again, based on the items that we get in the PTR, but there is a silver lining here. Right now, a Bone Necro and an Auradin are sort of on a different planet when you look at them compared to anything else. But just imagine if those classes were dialed back to something a little more reasonable. Look at the balance from all of these other classes, again, preliminarily based on what we see. It's obviously not going to be something final until we have some of the top players playing on these classes with the items that they desire. But the variety of different classes that you can use competitively in PvP with this patch is potentially mind-blowing. So in a nutshell, if we dial back the Bone Necro, cut auras back to what they were, and potentially give Sins some buffs elsewhere, I think this could be one of the healthiest times of PvP in the entirety of Diablo 2. We're still continuing to test this patch on the PTR, so just make sure you join us on stream if you got something specific you'd like us to check out. Regardless, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think down in the comments.